There are a ton of cliched phrases to pick from that express the idea that things generally get worse before they get better, that people will, and regularly do, rage against something new before they decide it's not so bad after all. Be it advances in civil rights, a new technology, or even a change in political leadership, there will always be someone somewhere looking to spread fear and misinformation in order to protect their own interests, make people feel uncertain about what lies ahead, or cast doubt on whatever the brand new thing is. Fear, uncertainty, and doubt. FUD. And in today's modern, politically charged world, there's a whole lot of it going about. From FUD about immigrants and or refugees, to FUD about the LGBTQIA+ community, FUD about people whose political leanings are different from your own, and yes, even FUD about COVID-19 vaccines and preventative healthcare. It honestly feels like we're living in a world where FUD drowns out a whole lot of common sense and critical thinking. And just like all those other areas where FUD is seemingly growing, we're seeing more FUD than ever before when it comes to electric vehicles. So today, I'm going to examine how and why FUD is worse than ever before, ask what you can do to counter it, and examine if things are going to get better anytime soon. It's no secret that there's a massive rise in electric vehicle and renewable energy misinformation. And while you might be forgiven for thinking it all comes from just one place, we actually think it can be boiled down to three main groups, which are all in some way or another interconnected. Some of the misinformation comes from nefarious sources whose sole purpose is to benefit from the status quo that currently exists and controls much of the energy and transportation market. Let's call this group the vested interest group. Some of it comes from poor journalism or sensationalist reporting that, for whatever reason, fails to capture the nuance of the situation, maliciously or innocently, leading to large groups of people becoming misinformed about the topic at hand. Let's call this group the click chasers. And finally, some of it comes from people who are either willfully ignorant, lack the motivation, skill, or time to get a more balanced, nuanced understanding of the situation, or are societally brainwashed to have a particular standpoint, be it from a political leader, a friend, a co-worker, or a social media post. Let's call this group the brainwashed. There are also, of course, trolls and bots, but they are particularly tricky to categorize, and you're going to see them popping up in multiple contexts throughout the video. The toughest misinformation to counter is that from the first group, the vested interests group. That's not only because this group contains large corporations willing to spend as much money as it takes to retain control of the market, but it also contains corporations, organizations, and sometimes individuals who are morally comfortable with the concept of pay to play. I can't discuss FUD against the EV industry without bringing in the spectre of big oil, the now accepted unofficial name for the group of misinformation that includes the world's oil companies and some oil-producing nations in OPEC, not to mention a significant swathe of legacy automaker shareholders and executives who have become very wealthy on the status quo, who would rather not upset the metaphorical apple cart, and instead they'd like us to continue to reap the rewards of keeping things just as they are. They would very much like it if EVs didn't exist, so they can continue to extract, refine, and sell petroleum products to the world. At the same time, continuing to suck in massive subsidies to do that. Big oil represents trillions of dollars of wealth around the world, and big oil, even though it likes to publicly make big promises about going green, is still very much vested in extracting as many carbon-intensive fuels from the earth as possible. And to up the cynicism a few gears, let's look at the fact that the majority of the world's oil companies knew, more than half a century ago, that increased burning of fossil fuels resulted in an acceleration of anthropogenic climate change, but rather than try to stop, opted to lie and obfuscate the fact. Since Kate Elliott did a really amazing video on that about a year ago, I'm not going to rehash the topic here, and instead I'll link to her video in the doobly-doobly. And you don't need to be an avid watcher of Mad Men or any other period drama set in the advertising world to know how much sway advertising can have on the opinions of the wider population. Don Draper helped sell cigarettes at a time when there was significant pushback against the tobacco industry due to the known effects consuming tobacco products have on the human body. For every Don Draper selling cigarettes, there's another one happily selling fossil fuels, espousing the benefits of internal combustion engine vehicles and dismissing the proposition of switching to an EV. Sadly, as well, thanks to decades upon decades of fossil fuel subsidies and pro-fossil fuel policies, in most of the world's most influential countries, oil company profits far outpace many other industries. Just as pharmaceutical companies in the US have managed to buy and cajole and advertise their way into the minds of consumers, so too have big oil done the same. And as electric vehicles have become more of a worthy competitor to traditional ICE vehicles, so too has the heat been turned up against them. This is all before we even look at the impact of politics. In last week's video on the National Auto Dealer Association conference in Las Vegas, again, link in the description below, I pointed out that lobbying in the US from auto dealers and the auto dealer industry as a whole already sat at $2.879 million for the current election cycle, and that automakers have also donated more than $1.563 million to the same election cycle. Those figures, though, pale into insignificance when compared to the money that's been sent to politicians by the energy sector, mostly oil and gas companies. Over the same period of time, more than $60.5 billion has been spent on political campaigning, with $1.6 billion going to Democrats, $1.8 billion to liberal groups, $8.8 billion to Republicans, and just under $48.5 billion to conservative groups. And if you can't grok that larger number, don't worry, because I can't grok it either, but let's try. $60 billion or thereabouts is enough to fund the retirement accounts of between 20 and 30,000 Generation Xers, with the $2 to $3 million that most financial analysts now say each of us should have in our savings account in order to comfortably retire into old age. Or, to put it another way, it's nearly 970 times the gross domestic product of Tuvalu, one of the world's poorest nations, and the country most likely to not exist if our obsession with burning stuff continues unabated. Or it's the 1.3 times the amount of money spent by Elon Musk to establish X as the most hated social media network of 2023. Your pick. That kind of immense money buys a lot of influence. And bless your Elon Musk. And it's no wonder that politicians are lining up to take potshots at EVs as a consequence. And while, yes, there are some lovely people to the right side of the political spectrum who identify as fiscal conservatives and are socially liberal and very supportive of clean vehicles and clean energy because electric vehicles are a more sustainable and fiscally sound way to move people around than digging more oil out of the ground using increasingly costly and dangerous methods. The majority of right-leaning politicians and conservative-identified voters are, en masse, less likely to be pro-EV. But before you think this is just a US thing, think again. Political parties around the world generally, although not always, follow the same kind of pattern. Those who are more focused towards traditional conservative values tend towards being less enthusiastic about EVs and are more likely to want fewer environmental controls and policies designed to safeguard the planet we live on, and are more likely at the same time to want to allow corporations the freedom to do whatever they'd like to do with minimal consequences. Meanwhile, political parties that are more liberal or socialist in their outlook, and yeah, I'm using the actual definition of socialism rather than the often bizarre US concept of it, which tends to basically encompass anything that people think is in some way quote-unquote woke, or has any kind of restrictions on businesses doing what they want, and damn the consequences for the rest of us, tend towards policies that are more EV-friendly, push for more environmental protections, and are more likely to spend at least some money in terms of abatements and incentives to get those things to happen. It's no wonder then that the majority of campaign donations from the fossil fuel industry, and the automotive industry as a whole, go towards Republican and conservative causes. Except, and this is really important, there are some interesting exceptions to all of this. First, in the US at least, there are more EV factories in traditionally conservative states. This is primarily because even though traditionally democratic states are likely to represent more EV sales, they're also states with the toughest laws for worker protections, workplace safety, and environmental protection. It's generally cheaper and less hassle for automakers to build factories in traditionally red states, where they are less likely to get fined for dumping toxic waste in a ditch. And you can bet that there's some significant campaign fund donations taking place to ensure those factories get green lit. And if you consider where the US auto facilities currently making EVs or EV battery packs are based, you'll note they're almost exclusively in the US's South, Southwest, and Midwest, areas known for having more conservative political leanings. In fact, while Elon Musk has vociferously claimed multiple times he wanted to move Tesla to Texas to avoid California's woke mind virus, it's an open secret that Texas is nowhere near as strict on employment law, health and safety, and environmental protections as California. Environmental protections that California is currently claiming Tesla has run afoul of. Next, I'd be remiss for not acknowledging the fact that even though the current incumbent of the White House is a Democrat and the US is promising a transition to EVs, it is also currently producing more fossil fuels per day than at any point in its history, despite what some Republican presidential campaigns would like you to believe. So, like I said, while there are generalizations about which parties are likely to be pro-EV than not, it is not as clear-cut as you might think it is, and politics, wherever it is taking place, is a messy, convoluted pile of greed and money trying to exact control over whomever is currently in control and whoever might be in control next. But look, we've gone off piste a little, so let's get back to the source of the actual problem. People with money seeking to influence people who aren't going to do due diligence, which brings me to the second group, media, of which obviously we fit in. The gold standard of journalism expects that whenever a journalist is covering a news story, they do substantial research trying to uncover the truth of whatever it is they're reporting on rather than blindly accepting one side or another's take. A good journalist asks why someone has the opinion they does some background research, and figures out exactly what the real story is. Except we all live in a world of late-stage capitalism where everything is about money and how much money you can make in a shorter amount of time as possible. A world where there's increasing pressure on reporters and journalists to focus on volume of output rather than quality of output. And a world where both-siderism is a plague that allows news organisations to portray controversy and gather clicks by using dissent from four mouthy folks on Facebook and claiming it's widespread opinion that challenges the scientific consensus on climate change or EVs or trans healthcare or whether coffee is better than tea. And having worked in traditional broadcasting, magazine publishing, online journalism, and YouTube. I can tell you there's been a march in the last 3 decades away from what many of us would consider traditional journalism. And that's before we even get into editorial biases, which we will in a second. Simply put, underpaid, overworked, stressed reporters are going to make more mistakes than they might if they were well paid, had a moderate workload, and were given more time to do actual journalism. But it's a dying art in many parts of the world, and that means they're less likely to be able to spend the time and energy working on a story they might like. Newspapers, just like news channels and radio stations, have to make money to pay their staff, and commercial pressure dictates more of the byline than you might think. Add into that the fact that most regional and some national news outlets don't have experts on staff who know the first thing about EVs, or often any local staff at all, and you're left with a bit of a malaise of uselessness surrounding many EV stories. Many regional news networks that were also at one time completely independent have been purchased by large mega media organisations like the Sinclair Group. I will link below to an expose from John Oliver on that very topic, and it's easy to see how corporate interests get put before facts and real journalism. And even if a journalist tries their best, they're often subject to the same misinformation and misunderstandings that the rest of the population suffers from. And without proper information about EVs from the auto industry and auto dealers, see last week's video, misinformation is high. I have frankly lost track of the number of times that EV misinformation has been spread either because a journalist wasn't aware of where to go for information, or they were given incorrect information by a dealership or automaker, or they weren't given enough time to properly research the thing. Or, maybe they were given an editorial remit to push a particular angle, which, believe me, also happens. Which brings me to the concept of talking heads. I have, semi-regularly at least, been a talking head guest on various BBC Radio 4 and BBC World Service programmes, giving my opinion on particular breaking news stories in the EV world. The interviews are usually pre-recorded and they do get edited before they go on air, meaning an editorial team can shape what you, the expert, is recorded as saying online. That can dramatically change the context and certainly aid in misinformation. But let's be clear here, that misinformation and editorial control is usually as a consequence of one person, an editor, making decisions about what the story is, and that means that they can often be different decisions to what the expert or the original journalist might have stated. And I don't want to labour the point on this. I've also been the victim of an editorial rewrite before. An article I wrote for a news site was completely rewritten by the editor to say the exact opposite of what I had originally said, because the editor felt that it was a more interesting and or controversial angle. But they kept my name on the byline. And again, editors are under pressure, often from their bosses, to be controversial and sensationalist because, as the British tabloid press is more than happy to admit, salaciousness and sensationalism sells. Now, to confuse and compound this problem, let's add in the wonders of AI, the ChatGPTs of the world, which are pretty crap at traditional journalism. Ask any ChatGPT-esque bot to write you a story about electric cars and they'll happily trot out some tired old tropes because sadly most AI systems are trained on scads of text illegally scraped from the internet. And unlike at least some of the population, they're not so discerning at figuring out what's factually correct and what's not. There have been tons of evidence-backed investigative pieces, actually well written too, often by academics or citizen journalists, showing that AIs have the same flaws as much of society. They suffer from implicit racism, implicit gender biases, and many more terrible things because the data they were trained on has those same terrible tendencies in it. Garbage in, garbage out. The problem? AI can generate stories faster than a human. It doesn't fact check, and that's led to a whole host of horrible online content created and promoted by AI. You can spot the articles and the videos fairly easily at this point because they're often completely full of nonsense. For videos, they're often completely full of B-roll with no actual A-roll of a human talking to a camera. They also contain computer-generated voices and usually don't cite their sources or B-roll. We see videos like this on a daily basis pop up in our YouTube feed and on Facebook, often with hundreds of thousands of views in a short period of time. And that's not because people are gullible enough to click, but often because the content is created by AI, and then AI farms click on the video and metaphorically watch, adding computer-generated comments to boot. The AI that runs YouTube or other online platforms counts that bot activity as a positive engagement, doubly so if the comments are controversial, and before you know it, you're seeing the content pop up in your timeline. And it's not just anti-EV stuff. Science educator Kyle Hill has been battling YouTube content scammers and spoofers for some time now, and he's doing everything he can to battle computer-generated misinformation online. Again, links below. Sadly, like this channel, he's struggling beneath the sheer volume of disinformation. And here I add in the obvious. With journalism and the free press under attack both commercially and politically, more and more traditional journalists are giving up. And we have considered it multiple times this year. And it's only the second week of February. The amount of nonsense we have to tackle on a daily basis from our comments section is several orders of magnitude higher than it was a few years ago, and the signal-to-noise ratio is terrible. And we don't make enough money from our platform to keep doing this. Those with money, be they political or from companies, are more than willing to spend thousands on AI content that makes them look good and others look bad. And in many cases, they're also willing to pay real humans a pittance to spread misinformation through human-farmed spam operations. People who work for these will often make hundreds of posts a day using many different fake accounts that are often tied with more traditional spam operations in countries around the world where international law enforcement efforts are impossible or at best really difficult. And sadly, platforms like YouTube, while they publicly claim they're doing everything to fight misinformation and spam, honestly do not care about small creators who are being inundated with this kind of stuff. In this case, we've actually been punished by the mighty YouTube algorithm for moderating misinformation, even though YouTube has told us multiple times that's not how the AI-generated algorithm works. Which brings me to the final part. The misinformed, the willfully ignorant, the gullible. With misinformation at an all-time high, it is no wonder that a large proportion of people don't understand the first thing about electric vehicles, and many of them don't want to, either because they're just too busy just surviving, paying bills, or getting by, or are mentally exhausted from the nightmarish news cycle that exists every day, or they are themselves fearful of change. It might appear that willfully ignorant people are in the majority, but I usually find that people who are willfully ignorant are that way because they've been conditioned to believe a particular viewpoint rather than being incapable of change. People who consume one particular type of media, like Fox News, for example, are much more likely to have a negative view of electric vehicles than those who consume a variety of different media sources. That's actually the same as it would be for political viewpoints, and there are a bunch of surveys and studies showing that over the last 20 years or so, exposure to opinions other than your own has dropped as it's become increasingly easy to find and then lock yourself in metaphorical echo chambers. But it's not just EVs. Hot button topics of all types are treated in a very similar way online. And thanks to a lack of policing when it comes to misinformation, not to mention people misunderstanding what the First Amendment of the US Constitution is really about, we are seeing more and more misinformation passed off as fact when it's anything but. By the way, the First Amendment isn't about freedom to say whatever you want without consequences. As the recent court case between former President Trump and author E. Jean Carroll has shown, defamation and disinformation is not protected under the First Amendment. Basically, if you're going to say something abhorrent and terrible, or something truthful and accurate, you need to have evidence to back that thing up. I could at this point bring up the scads of misinformation passed off as fact about immigrants, refugees, and LGBTQ plus folk, or indeed whatever the latest political scandal is. And just as we get people commenting in our comment section about how terrible EVs are and how they're a fire risk and how they're never going to take off, so too do we have people making vile, abhorrent comments about migrants and queer people and trans people. Often those making the comments are completely unwilling to listen to anything other than what they believe to be the truth and aren't interested in facts. They're only interested in whatever it is they have been told to believe. Or paid to believe. All of this misinformation is made even worse by the fact that, and I'm going to say it, however unpopular it is, not everyone really knows how to research. I consider myself lucky. I was a nerd before the internet became popular, and while I wasn't always a straight A student, I kinda got distracted quite a lot in class. I did at least learn how to research things in the library and how to evaluate evidence for factual accuracy. Those skills transferred to the internet because the internet was still growing as I was in high school and university. I very quickly learned that not everything online was trustworthy or accurate. I worked on my university papers using old-fashioned books. And I still use the skills I learned in school to evaluate and research to this day. If you are a nerdy Gen Xer like me, or perhaps a nerdy millennial, the chances are that you'll be in a similar place. But if you are less nerdy, or your experience of the internet is primarily social media, you are probably less likely to evaluate what you read, especially if the information you are consuming comes from people you know or associate with. It's easier to discount something you read online if it's from someone you don't know, but it's much harder to discount it if it comes from a family member, trusted friend, or colleague. And that, sadly, is the insidious nature of FUD today. We are in a metaphorical perfect storm. A storm where political donations are at an all-time high driven by record profits, where misinformation is consequentially at an all-time high because of the money being spent on it, and where those who don't want people to like electric cars and a bunch of other things have huge amounts of money to spend on ensuring that their opinions are the ones being shouted the loudest. Combine that with the power that political donations can now have over elected officials, and it is bad all round. And on top of all of that, we have a bunch of disinformation from EV fans eager to spread misinformation about any legacy automaker that isn't Tesla, and people who aren't willing to examine or investigate things for themselves. They have a them versus us mentality that portrays a legacy auto as all bad and Tesla as all good. And again, that is not how the world works, especially of late. And yes, again, I'm sorry, I'm going to make the connection between this and LGBTQ plus rights because I'm seeing this same kind of hate spread as I am seeing in the EV world. And because of what our company does and who works at this company, we get it twice over. It sucks, but don't worry. I think there is a solution. Join me at the main camera. This is where you come in and get involved. Misinformation is rife. It comes from all sides, but with some basic skills, you can dig down. Ask who is spreading the information. Where does it come from? If it is a politician saying it, who's paying them to say it? If it's a company, ask where their interests lie. And look for evidence of spin, because it is everywhere. Most importantly, be critical when consuming information and ask yourself if what you're seeing or reading or hearing is plausible and verifiable. Often it's not, or there's missing context that's not immediately obvious. A good example is what happened earlier last year when the Sun newspaper took a perfectly okay test drive from our channel and made it sound terrible. If in doubt, dig deep before you share. Be critical. You will notice that when we make videos, we regularly cite our sources, specifically so that you can go and check out the veracity of the source for yourself. And of course, while human content creators and journalists are just that, only human, if they do make mistakes, look for corrections. Outlets that publish corrections are generally more interested in being honest than ones that don't. Next, we should look for signs of AI, either through lots of badly written prose or poorly produced and narrated videos. Narration where the vocal pattern feels off or the voice seems to randomly rise or fall for no reason is a good indicator of a video script narrated by a computer. Videos that feature no actual human on camera is also a good sign of AI-generated content, which, sadly, is often FUD. So are phrases like, "You won't believe what we learned," or "They couldn't believe their eyes," or something similar. And if a video contains footage from another channel without any citations, or use a disclaimer in the description that says, "Please contact us here for copyright concerns," you are most certainly dealing with AI-generated or spam content. Additionally, don't get suckered into the mindset where criticism equals bad. It is possible to accurately report a news story in a way that results in a negative overall impression to the reader or viewer without assuming the person who produced the story is a bad person or somehow wants the company they're covering to fail. In our case, we are often accused of hating on Tesla because we are willing to be critical as well as give praise when Tesla or Elon Musk does something we professionally think isn't a good thing. We do the same for other automakers and news stories too, but you wouldn't believe the number of people who claim we're being pro or anti something because of one positive story or one negative story. And that is not how the news world works. And where possible, the more context offered, the more likely it is that someone is trying to be fair rather than hyper-partisan or hateful. Finally, and this is a big one, be wary of stories shared by friends and family on social media that appear very one-sided or have an ulterior motive. Be willing to challenge people who share misinformation, but please don't get into a screaming match at each other. Provide evidence to counter misinformation rather than just scream into the void, and be patient with someone whose worldview to that point hasn't been the same as yours. Good dialogue, facts, and empathy go a long way to helping someone who has been fed FUD deal with the fact that what they thought was true isn't. It's also a much nicer thing to do as a human than just shout each other down. At least, it is when the alternative works. Thanks for joining me today, and if you've got thoughts, make sure you leave them below in our Discord chat room, or you can reach out to us on Mastodon. Thanks to the amazing list of people scrolling right by on your screen right now. They are some of the more than 1,500 people who help fund this channel every month through Patreon and YouTube, covering our bills, paying our team, and making sure that we can remain 100% independent. If you'd like to join them and see your name listed here, just follow the links below. There are a range of different tiers you can sign up for, from as little as $1 a month, or if you pay yearly, just under $11 a year. A massive welcome to our newest supporters: Carl B. Knapp, Stoyal Pankoff, Smithers, John Strott, Kelly, Joseph Valentinetti, John Flint, and Nate Fritz. To join the list and get your shout out, become a paid Patreon member for your week of fame. If you'd like to support us with a one-off donation, you'll find links below to make Ko-fi and Bitcoin donations, and we even have an old-fashioned PO box you can reach us at. The address is also below. And if you're in need of some swag, you'll find our swag store also in the down below. This month, we're campaigning for an end to charging deserts with an amazing new t-shirt design by our in-house artist and animator, Erin. Get yours today by heading to our Redbubble store. We've got some great content coming up, so make sure you're subscribed on PeerTube or YouTube, and we'll see you soon. We make new videos every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. If you want more, the mighty algorithm thinks you'll enjoy this video, but we think that this one is also well worth a look. See you soon, and as always, keep evolving.